Welcome to Gaslit Nation. I'm Andrea Chalupa, a writer and the producer and screenwriter of the upcoming journalistic thriller, Mr. Jones.
And I'm Sarah Kendzior, a journalist and scholar of authoritarian states focusing on the former Soviet Union and the author of the essay collection, The View from Flyover Country.
We are here today with Vanity Fair contributing editor Craig Unger, the author of the New York Times-bestselling book, House of Trump, House of Putin, The Untold Story of Donald Trump and the Russian Mafia. A must-read and deeply researched book that reminds us yet again that Trump properties are a laundromat for Russian mafia money, have been for years, and that Trump's ambition to run for president and efforts to run for president go back several years as well, and so do his contacts with the Soviet Union, Russian oligarchs close to Putin, and so forth. So Russiagate, of course, did not happen overnight. It was the natural culmination of decades of corruption by Donald Trump, decades of self-interest in power for power's sake, and self-enrichment through pro-Kremlin sources, including the mafia. He is also the author of House of Bush, House of Saud, the secret relationship between the world's two most powerful dynasties. So how are you still alive, Craig Unger?
I don't know, just luck. I get bad luck, I'm afraid, but...
You have done these two books about these two very controversial topics, and now we're at a pivotal moment in U.S. history and not a particularly good one. What connections do you see between your two books?
Well, there are actually several, and one is, I realize I've done 4 books now that could all be subtitled The Republican Party's War Against Democracy. And the first one was House of Bush, House of Saud. I sometimes get them confused. There are too many houses in it. But when I wrote it, it was a very funny thing happened, which was it had just been published, and I gave a talk at Columbia University. And after the talk, a guy came out of the audience and took me aside and invited me to lunch. And he was Russian. And he was with the Russian consulate. And I saw no harm in having lunch with him. And it didn't really occur to me till about 15 years later what was really going on. Because essentially what I write about is power and how power really works, and I try to unmask the hidden mechanisms of power. And what House of Bush, House of Saud shows is how a bunch of young, incredibly rich Saudis came here, knowing no one, and wormed their way up to the highest echelons of power in the United States legally. They took advantage of all the loopholes. And I realized I gave the Russians a blueprint on what to do with this. Now, believe me, I think a lot of people belong in jail. Don't get me wrong. And I'm delighted to see Paul Manafort going off to Rikers. But a huge portion of this, the real scandal, as Mike Kinsley used to say, is the real scandal is what is legal and what you can get away with legally. And I think the Russians have figured that out to a huge extent. And I think the Trump-Russia scandal, Trump or not, is going to go on for many, many years till we get to the bottom of it. But a huge portion of it is how many loopholes there are in our legal system. And the K Street lobbying system, for example, in House of Trump, House of Putin, I talked to one of my sources was an American businessman who'd gone to Russia in the 90s, just after the Soviet Union had folded. And he realized he was getting in pretty deep stuff. And one of the Russians he was trying to do business with wanted to bribe Tom DeLay, in fact, the then Speaker of the House. And he said, no, you can't do that. That's illegal. But why don't you come with me to K Street? And he explained the whole K Street lobbying system to the Russian, who said, oh, you've legalized bribery. How wonderful. And they've taken up all those. And you can see it in the big law firms that are taking over the DOJ right now. And if you look at the Southern District of New York, you have people who are working for, I'm going to mangle his name, but the number 2 guy at Southern District, I'm talking about Robert Khuzami, if I'm pronouncing his name correctly, but he was, I believe, the number 2 guy at the Southern District of New York. But he had been at Kirkland & Ellis, where in 2017 his salary was $11 million representing Deutsche Bank. So now he's going to prosecute these cases. Tell me how that's going to work. And you have to take that kind of the conflict, and there are 30, 40 of those from the top on down, from William Barr on down. And a huge number of the lawyers are from either Kirkland and Ellis or Jones Day.
This is the same kind of lines that I've been thinking about, where they basically have infiltrated the system and structured the system in order to preemptively exonerate themselves against present and future crimes. I was wondering, for our audience that's not as familiar with the contours of this, can you explain just what is the, quote, Russian mafia, or is it more of a transnational mafia? Like, what kind of criminal entity are we looking at?
Right. Well, the Russian mafia, I think the most important difference to Americans, the difference between the Russian mafia and the Italian-American mafia that we know and love and saw in The Godfather and all that, and we saw Rudy Giuliani prosecute and all that, was the Italian-American mafia was always at war with the FBI. And the Russian mafia is a state actor. And this is hugely important, and it's not just speculation on my part. I interviewed General Oleg Kalugin, who had been head of counterintelligence for the KGB, and he said, "Oh, the Russian mafia, they worked with us." And he told me how he used to come over here to Brooklyn, and he would go to restaurants and night spots like Rasputin and Tatanya, which were the old hangouts for the Russian mafia, and he would recruit people there. So it's very much part of that. Similarly, I've talked to people in the Russian mafia, and they make it very clear. So if you want to follow the money in this scandal, and that to me is what's amazing. I try to do it in my book, but it's like no one among the major press is following where is the money coming from, what is going on here. And what you see is a plan, and I think this dates back to the fall of the Soviet Union, and I think the conventional wisdom is completely wrong, and I'm trying to rewrite history a little bit by saying that, you know what, maybe we didn't win the Cold War, and that Russia really won the Cold War. And what Americans saw was the very genial face of Mikhail Gorbachev, who was in fact pretty easygoing. What we didn't see was what the KGB was doing. And they set up, had secret plans, and they were run by a guy named General Khrushchev, who who could see the fall of the Soviet Union coming. And he set up a plan to create over 600 companies that would exist as real companies, many of them multi-billion-dollar companies trading commodities. But in fact, they would be run by KGB operatives. And so we see what came out of that. And the one instance, I go to it in depth in House of Trump, House of Putin, is you see the Ukraine energy trade, and you see Semyon Mogalevich, who's one of the most powerful Russian mobsters, sort of being granted the Ukraine energy trade, which means he's allowed to take this enormous amounts of liquid natural gas and so forth that start out in Russia and Turkmenistan and go through pipelines in the Ukraine. And he's essentially able to skim off huge amounts of money off the top. It was around $750 million a year. And that's where the money, when I say let's follow the money, that's what I start to look at. And that money needs to be laundered, and it needs political protection in Ukraine, which means let's bring in Paul Manafort. One good way to launder it is through real estate. And it would be great to have a real estate mogul who's got thousands of condos he can sell without asking any questions. And the real estate regulations are incredibly lax. When I talk about legal corruption, that's what I'm talking about. It is very, very easy to launder money legally through real estate because they don't ask any questions.
I have so many questions about all the things you just said. I have wondered about whether, we did all get it wrong about the collapse of the Soviet Union, about the end of the Cold War. And I'm somebody, I got a PhD studying Uzbekistan, and all of these scholars would talk about their hubris and about their inability to predict this collapse, how it came about so abruptly in the late 80s and early 90s that they were just startled by the whole thing. In retrospect, it seems like they were maybe on the ball until that time, and there was, an egotistical moment afterwards where they were like, America is the last remaining superpower. Russia has been thoroughly defeated. All of the republics have become independent. They've become dependent on us. They want to now enter the West. You had the last man and the end of history, blah, blah, blah. Is this something that you think was like a long plan, or just sort of a wonderful array of coincidences and loosening of legal loopholes over time that produced the situation we're in now? Or was this really something the KGB thought to kind of drag out over a couple of decades in order to strengthen its possibilities for them to dominate a new world order? And I know that sounds nuts, but I know that you know this stuff, so I want to know your opinion.
Right, there were different factions and fighting for different things. And I think Gorbachev really was who he appeared to be, but General Khrushchev, who was head of the KGB, really was looking long into the future, hoping for this resurrection of the Russians' imperial ambitions. And part of the thing with the KGB is you don't just quit and retire. You're always there. So that when I talk to American businessmen who were doing business with people they knew had been part of the KGB, they wrote it off and said, oh, well, that's in the old days. That's when the Soviet Union, that's over. Well, it wasn't over. And some of them were shocked to find that was the case. But I think these companies and some of the people who were in them did have long-term plans. And when you look at one of the key people in that is a guy named Boris Birstein, who had a company called Sibaco. And I write about this at some length in House of Trump, House of Putin. And this was a company with KGB people in it. Boris Birstein oversaw a meeting of all the big Russian mobsters in Tel Aviv in 1995, at which point they decided to give Semyon Mogalevich control of the Ukraine energy trade. That meant he could skim about $750 million a year off the top.
Today we're talking about Third Love, a great company that lets you skip the trip when it comes to bra shopping. We at Gaslit Nation know it's a pain to take time out of the fight against fascism to go shopping for bras. Thanks to Third Love, you can get it done online fast and fight for your rights in style. Using Third Love's online Fit Finder quiz, you can order your bras and try them on at home. Third Love uses data points generated by millions of women who've taken their Fit Finder quiz to design bras for a perfect fit and premium feel. You just answer a few simple questions to find your perfect fit in 60 seconds. Third Love offers a 100% fit guarantee in over 70 sizes. Every customer has 60 days to wear it, wash it, and put it to the test. If you don't love it, you can return it, and Third Love will wash it and donate it to a woman in need. Third Love's team of expert fit stylists are available every day to help via text, chat, or phone. Returns and exchanges are free and easy. Third Love knows there's a perfect bra for everyone, so right now they're offering our listeners 15% off your first order. Go to thirdlove.com/gaslit now to find your perfect fitting bra and get 15% off your first purchase. That's thirdlove.com/gaslit for 15% off today.
So what makes Mogalevich the brainy Don, as he is called? He's the head of the Russian Mafia. Robert Mueller, as director of the FBI in 2011, held him up as the prime example of how the mafia works in the 21st century. It's no longer a bunch of Italians sitting in some restaurant, as you mentioned, like The Godfather, that scene. It's no longer that. It's the corruption in accounting firms and law firms, in blood money operatives, and all types of corrupt oligarchs making their money in these struggling democracies and then washing it in ritzy real estate in Western capitals, and everybody making money in those Western capitals and turning a blind eye, including a lot of the big sort of deal makers in London and New York and so forth, including members of government. So, and in this speech, which he held up as the Iron Triangle speech, he said that Mogalevich is the face of what the mafia looks like in the 21st century, and that he will remain on the FBI 10 Most Wanted list until he is caught. So the reason why this show exists, and will forever exist, is because we will not stop until we get an answer to this question, is why do you think under James Comey, just a few years later, under James Comey, in December of 2015, When the Russian Mafia aided Kremlin effort to get Donald Trump elected president of the United States, their longtime buddy, their longtime recipient of all that dirty cash, why do you think James Comey in December 2015, when Manafort was just about to be elected to run the campaign, why would James Comey take the head of the Russian Mafia off the 10 most wanted list? Do you have any ideas there?
Well, these are questions I've been asking, and I don't have all the answers. I mean, one thing that's very clear is when you look who Mogalevich hired as his lawyer, it was William Sessions, who had been head of the FBI before then. And his son, Pete Sessions, was a congressman, was one of the very, very few, he may have been the only Republican in Congress who voted against sanctions for Russia. So that was interesting. I was delighted to see Pete Sessions was defeated in the last election. But another famous FBI guy, Louis Freeh, was also, he was representing Prevezon in this. So you have suddenly the big, powerful lawmakers who seem to be going very, very easy on the Russian Mafia. I mean, another thing that people haven't noticed is, I think it was in 1991, the Russians had, or rather the FBI had 300 agents on the Russian Mafia. And the new Attorney General shifted them to go after the crack epidemic and not, these were FBI agents, many of whom spoke Russian. So suddenly they're shifted to the crack epidemic.
What year would this be about?
This would be, yes. And so the pop
Which
quiz
year was
is
this? Which year?
91.
Okay.
So who do you think was Attorney General in that year?
Oh my God. Barr?
William Barr.
So what you're describing here is we're talking about decades of revolving door corruption. So just like the SEC has this revolving door where the SEC is tasked with, of course, the watchdog, the government's watchdog of Wall Street. But what it becomes is a place for people to come and go, leaving Wall Street and working at the SEC, coming back. It's just a revolving door of corruption. And that's why Wall Street has become this gambling den of thieves. So what you are describing in your many books is that essentially our own law enforcement that's supposed to be tasked with protecting us has become a sort of SEC-style revolving door of corruption, where people work in the FBI and then they go rake in the money in private practice, and then they come back to the FBI and they have their network, they have their professional network, and they basically are helping each other out to protect these criminals over time.
Something like that. And also, I mean, if you go into the world of the big white shoe law firms, I guess I hadn't not followed that world for a while. So when I last looked, big lawyers were making $3 or $4 million a year. Now it's $10, $12 million a year. And they're making it representing Alpha Bank, Rosneft, Deutsche Bank, or Deripaska, all the big oligarchs. And these are big-time lawyers who are at Jones Day and Kirkland & Ellis, and a lot of them have ended up in the Justice Department, and now they're supposedly prosecuting this?
I mean, one of the things that kind of...
We're in the wrong business, Sarah.
Yeah, apparently. So where was the rest of the FBI on this? Where was the intelligence community on this? Like, how was this not seen as a major sovereignty, national security problem?
Well, the CIA just said it wasn't their purview, that it was really the FBI's. And I did talk to John Cipher, and, you know, they're in Moscow trying to penetrate the Soviet Union or Russian operatives. So they don't want to cozy up and reveal their own identities to the Russian mobsters. What the FBI's most aggressive thing they did is they established what was known as the Budapest Task Force. And some people who've appeared in the Trump-Russia scandal were working there, going after the Russian mafia, Lisa Page, and several others. And I've always suspected when I see Trump going after someone like Lisa Page, she's hardly a household name. So far as I know, she's very good at her work, but he keeps going after her, and he's gone after a lot of people who are clearly quite knowledgeable about the Russian mafia. I mean, one thing that I don't want to leave out is I found at least I believe it's 13 people who are part of the Russian Mafia who had either bought into Trump Tower or bought Trump condos in one way or another. So this is over a 35-year period. It goes back to 1984. And when you think of the Russian Mafia, and remember always that it is a state actor, it is part of Russian intelligence. And one of their headquarters, on and off for 35 years, is 721 Fifth Avenue, Trump Tower, the crown jewel of Donald Trump's empire.
There was interest from the FBI and the intelligence community in the Russian Mafia. This was a period where they were clamping down on it. You also saw efforts in journalism, people like Robert I. Friedman, writing these exposés of Mogalevich, and his organized crime network. Then 9/11 happens, and it just seems like they just dropped that ball entirely. Does that sound right to you?
Well, 9/11 was, and it was legitimate. So that is part of it, but I don't think it's the entire thing. I really don't. And I don't know. And I'd love to interview Lisa Page if you're listening. I think there are people like that who are much more knowledgeable, but the FBI is not come forward about it. And one of the key questions is, to what extent are they going to follow up on this? This is, it is not over, it is ongoing, so that we know, it's also more and more dangerous, I think, the longer Trump is in power, that he's taking critical agencies like the Justice Department, and I'm sure he'll be moving into the intelligence sector as well. And he's taking them over, and he's wiping out what the institutions that really do protect us.
Well, I would say the answer to how did this operation not get stopped when it was clearly accelerating in recent years on Obama's watch, I think the answer to that would be, of course, with people like Lisa Page and generally women, because as we're seeing, it's women who are, from Reality Winner to Sally Yates and so forth, women who are sticking their necks out and paying the price with their careers, their freedom. There's also the whistleblower in the U.S. Treasury who tried to go through all the process.
Natalie Mayflower Edwards.
She was arrested for just alerting that there was treason in the Treasury. Go look up that BuzzFeed piece by Jason Leopold and Anthony Comier from end of December 2018, which is so damning. So to piece this together, we might want to talk to someone like Evelyn Farkas, who left the Obama administration. She was a top official overseeing military relations between Russia and Ukraine, and she resigned because she felt like the Obama administration just wasn't treating the threat the way they needed to, in sort of this resurgent Russian aggression. So I want to go ask about, because I know Sarah and I are like both in a candy store right now talking to you. and we're basically jostling, trying to get our questions in, and we both have so many. But just to sort of ground people into Mogalevich, because is he really central? Is he more mystique than man at this point? Or is he really that dangerous, brainy Don?
Well, it's a little of both. I think at times his power has been overstated, and the FBI documents themselves called him the boss of bosses, and I don't think that is the case. And I talked to people who are close to him in the Russian Mafia, and they said, no, he's maybe 3 or 4. But he is the brains. He's a financial genius behind it. And as many people have told me, Russia has no Goldman Sachs, they have Mogalevich. And if you have that kind of financial acumen, you go to work for him. And you could see through Mogalevich the change in character of the Russian Mafia from sort of low-life thuggery, extortion, prostitution, human trafficking, and the real sleazy down-low crimes to white-collar crimes, to pump-and-dump stock scams on Wall Street. And he sort of covered both ends. And I think he was crucial in consolidating power of the Russian Mafia in New York. That is, in 1992, they sent Vaslav Ivankov over here to take charge. And Ivankov was one of the most brutal mobsters ever, and he was famous for his brutality. And when the FBI was looking all over for him in Brooklyn, they finally found that he had a place in Trump Tower, which was just amazing to me,
In November 2016, when we were busy on the phone talking to anybody we can get on the phone that had any access to any information, we were talking to like a lot of high-up Republican operatives and people like close to McCain and others to try to be like, is our sovereignty over? What are you hearing? How can we stop this? Is it too late? And so one person that came into our orbit through that was an intelligence guy who had several decades working in intelligence, and he said, think of it this way. The election of Donald Trump to president of the United States was a marriage between the East, the Russian Mafia in the East, and the Russian Mafia in the West.
Right. No, I think that is the case in many ways, yes. Yeah. No, I mean, essentially, we're importing their kleptocracy, and Trump is the guy who's bringing it over. And I think you can see it in almost everyone in the administration.
Yeah, no, I always refer to it as a transnational crime syndicate because there are so many different countries involved. And it's not quite countries. It's these little oligarch, plutocrat networks within each country that don't have loyalty to their state. They have loyalty to their wallet. They have loyalty to their ability to get away with crimes without facing any repercussions. And on that note, I was curious to kind of go back into Mogalevich's biography. The way he was able to leave Russia was that Robert Maxwell procured him an Israeli passport, right? And for those listening, Robert Maxwell is a big publisher. We did an episode about him. He died suddenly in 1991. He fell off a yacht he had purchased from Adnan Khashoggi, who is the uncle or cousin of Jamal Khashoggi, because everyone has to be interrelated. Anyway, he also was a undercover Mossad operative. And so Mogalevich got a passport from him, was able to leave Russia for Israel, and then Israel for Hungary. Can you describe, lately there have been revelations having to do with Israeli actors in this scandal, like Black Cube, Psy Group, or Netanyahu himself, who's very connected to Kushner. What is the role of Israel or these various sort of mercenary parties that come from Israel in this conflict?
Well, it's definitely Israel's definitely one of the several legs in all of this, and I think you can bring in the Saudis as well. But this goes back really to the 1970s because there was a congressional act passed called the Jackson-Vanik Amendment, and that was a law that gave Russia-favored nation trading status if they would allow Jews to leave the Soviet Union. This is still the Soviet days. And essentially, it meant the only way out of the Soviet Union was through Israel. So you see Mogalevich and so forth, and a lot of people who weren't Jewish, pretending they were Jewish. Sergei Mikhailov, who's really the most powerful person in the Russian Mafia, got Israeli citizenship as well, and he was not Jewish. So this was very important. You also see a bunch of oligarchs who, Alexander Moskevich, there's Chodyev's. These were allies of Boris Beerstein, and they were essentially given various commodities, sectors that they could rule. You saw there were the aluminum wars with Deripaska and Chernoy. There were various minerals, and these were sort of given out to various segments of the Russian Mafia, and a lot of them were based in Israel for some time. But what really interested me, where I felt I was getting onto something, was when I realized you go back to the 90s when the new Russian Federation was just arising, and the Soviet Union was a poor country, but they had vast natural resources. And even in a country as small as Kyrgyzstan, if you get rights, you can be worth a few $1 billion or something. So these were handed out, and various key people who ended up making $1 billion or more out of this end up partnering with Donald Trump in Bayrock, which seems to me almost a latter-day reincarnation of the KGB companies.
Actually, I wanted to ask about Bayrock as related to Sater, because this is also part of the enigma.
Felix Sater is a key part of this, and I guess to some extent the speculation on my part, but yes, Felix Sater was a cooperator, and if you understand how the FBI works, the idea of having informants and cooperators, those are the most powerful tools they have, and if they make you a cooperator, they have to honor what they promise you, which is some sort of immunity. And most famously, if you go back a few years, there's the story of Whitey Bulger. And I don't know if your listeners are familiar with it, but the movie The Departed with Jack Nicholson, the Scorsese movie, is sort of a roman à clef based on Whitey Bulger. I lived in Boston for a few years, and he was the big-time Irish mobster, and it turns out he was a FBI cooperator, and they allowed him to go about his business as long as he was cooperating. But his business meant killing about, I think it was 11 Italian mobsters who were his rivals, and the FBI just turned a blind eye to him. Well, now we come to Felix Sater, and I have to wonder, was Felix Whitey Bulger on steroids? And it's a question I don't know the answer to. I don't think it's been confirmed, but it's a very, very interesting question, because Felix was partnering with Donald Trump. He was managing director of Bayrock. They were overseeing projects like the Trump Soho, which was laundering money. And so Felix was in deals where Trump was, where Russian mobsters were laundering money through Trump real estate. Didn't the FBI know that? Did they just turn a blind eye to it? They would have known it before the election, and they don't do anything.
Oh, they had a whole long list of crimes, and that they kind of easily flagged.
Well, and he also, Sater took Ivanka and Donald Jr. to Russia, right, in 2006 to sit in Putin's chair in the Kremlin, which is not a normal Russia tourist activity. I mean, how in the world did our government not take these pieces, which were, this is information in the public domain, like the Trump children have a habit of blurting all of this out. Donald Trump has a habit of blurting this out. You don't need to be in the FBI to figure it out. I guess I'm still stuck on why did they not see it then? And also, kind of to go back to what you said about the media not really covering this, like you've written this very detailed book, with an appendix of criminals at the end. Why is this not dominating the headlines? Why is there not more emphasis on this crime network now as it's threatening us in real time?
Right. The Washington Post has been pretty generous to me, and MSNBC has as well. But other than that, you're absolutely right. The New York Times won't touch it, and they clearly know about all this. I haven't asked them, but I think a large part of it, I think our media is really screwed up right now. I mean, it's desperate. And there are a number of reasons for it. I mean, one is just the internet has been terrible. I also think social media and Facebook has been a disaster and has atomized everything. I think in the mainstream media, a lot of people fall prey to what I call access journalism. They, I don't really want to attack specific reporters, but...
Oh, it's okay. This is Gaslit Nation. That's what we do.
I was researching a Russian mobster known as Taiwanchik, Limzhan Taktahanov, I believe, if I'm pronouncing his name right.
Limzhan.
Yeah, and he was running gambling rings and money laundering operations out of Trump Tower. And as I was researching, I saw a wonderful piece about him in the Washington Post from a few years back. The reporter who wrote that is at the New York Times. Won't touch it now, And you see that kind of thing again and again and again. I think one of the biggest criticisms I've gotten has been that so much of my material is open source, to which I say, yeah, so what? I mean, there are court documents about all these Russian mobsters. When I call someone a Russian mobster and it gets by the lawyers at Penguin Random House, it's because they were convicted generally, I'm not just making this stuff up. You have the court records. What I've tried to do is not look at the specific crimes so much as the relationships of the people in all the crimes, and you see when you put them together, oh, this is the Russian Mafia. This is how they operate. They all know each other. They all report to Mogalevich, and Mogalevich is close to Putin. And they siphon off $750 million from the Ukraine energy trade. And that's just one of many sectors, by the way. I focus on one because I want to keep a coherent narrative thread, but believe me, it's just a small part of what's going on.
Oh, without question. I hope you'll move in with us and we can just do this all the time, because I want to get through all these questions. The culture of it as well, if you could speak about sort of birds of feather flock together, and just how ostentatious this ruling class in Russia is, like this materialism, and it's so on brand with Trump. And for instance, Trump, like his kindred spirit, Berlusconi, they love the bunga bunga parties with underage girls. You describe the oligarchs, the lifestyle, to me, it sounds like Dante's circles of hell. Like that, none of that sounds fun to me. Where these oligarchs get together in like yacht competitions of who has the biggest yacht in the Mediterranean. They fly in 16-year-old virgins, children that have been trafficked for sex from a lot of these poor countries. And they fight over them. They have these sex parties, child prostitution, human trafficking. One oligarch had a collection of killed and stuffed endangered species. Like, I wanted to just burn the world down when I was reading this.
Right. I believe that was Mogalevich, and he had the bar stools on his yacht. He had 29 bar stools, and each bar stool was upholstered in the hide of a different endangered species.
That's so disgusting.
And when I wrote that sentence, and then I thought about it, and I realized, wait a minute, a lot of thought has to go into that. You have to figure out, well, what endangered species haven't I gotten to yet? Also, when you mention the 16-year-old virgins, I got the wiretap transcripts of those conversations, and there's a discussion among the staff who's negotiating the shipment of these young women. Is it worth paying a 50% premium for a virgin? I don't know. Is that too much? We have to send back the unpretty, was what one of the, no one wants her, and it's just disgusting beyond belief. And in the middle of one of these parties, Donald Trump was supposed to arrive and he couldn't make it, but he did a teleconference thing where this was a birthday party for Tevfik Arif, who was head of Bayrock. And he said, these are his good friends. This is the life, that is his life. You're absolutely right.
Manafort and Stone, the bad boys of the GOP that were servicing a lot of the GOP heavy hitters, including the rise of Reagan. Oh my God, your book is so incredible where it describes how Ronald Reagan becomes president, and Donald Trump is so excited about that. So he's like, this is my opportunity to end the Cold War. And he wanted to he had a solution on how to end. He got really interested in the Soviet Union sort of around that time.
Right. Well, I think the question is, I think when you get to the Mueller report, I don't think people are always asking the right questions, because to me, what is absolutely indisputable is that Donald Trump was compromised by Russia. And when and how did that happen is one good question. And I think it's probably not conclusive, but there is an enormous amount of highly suggestive data that suggests he was compromised in the 80s. And look at the sequence of events. 1984, a guy named David Bogadin, who's with the Russian Mafia, working under Mogalevich's wing, comes to Trump Tower. Trump Tower has just opened the year before. He brings $6 million in cash, that's the equivalent of about $15 million a day, and says, I'll take 5 condos. That was money laundering, according to the State Attorney General of New York. Now remember that the Russian mobsters are relaying that information to Russian intelligence, to the KGB. So the KGB knows that Trump is willing to turn a blind eye and do business with criminals. Essentially, they know that. What happens next is, a little over a year later, Ambassador Dubinin and his daughter go up to Trump Tower without an appointment. This is highly, highly unusual during the Cold War. It's a violation of all protocol. And they tell Trump, we want to have lunch with you. You've done such a terrific job. We'd like to have a Trump Tower in Moscow. Let's have lunch. Then they fly him over. He's married to Ivana in those days. And it's his first trip to Russia. I interviewed General Oleg Kalugin, who was head of counterintelligence for the KGB back in those days. And according to Kalugin, during that trip, Kalugin believed that they did get compromise of a sexual nature on Trump. Okay. Kalugin didn't see it. I can't guarantee that, but that's what he told me on the record in a taped interview. What happens next is really interesting because when Trump returns home, he immediately runs for president. People forget this. He ran for president in 1988, and he actually went to New Hampshire and did all those rites of passage that various Republican candidates do at the whatever diner in Portsmouth, New Hampshire, or wherever. And so he started his campaign. And what was most interesting about it didn't last long, but was most interesting was he took out full-page ads in the New York Times, Washington Post, and Boston Globe, and it put forth a foreign policy that could have been written by Leonid Brezhnev. I mean, it was just bazonkers saying NATO is terrible, the Western Alliance has got to stop, and this was, I don't think I've ever heard of any American making that kind of argument, certainly not at that time, because the Cold War was still going on.
So how does this fit in with the many attempts, the active interest that Donald Trump engaged in over the decades to run for president of the United States?
Yeah, because he picked up again. He almost ran in 96. He ran in 2000. He ran in 2012. And then, of course, 2016. This is a constant obsession with him. And this has been a pretty consistent platform for him, too. This sort of anti-NATO, all the other countries are ripping us off.
Right.
He's had his platform.
Not only that, it's always also with Roger Stone. I interviewed Roger in, I think it was 2008. Yeah, and it was just after the Elliot Spitzer thing. And and he said, watch Donald Trump, he's going to be president.
Wow.
And I thought he was crazy at the time, and it seemed absurd to me.
Yeah, no, it's very interesting to me, the consistency here. People think of Trump as this kind of volatile character, this kind of outsider, this renegade, but he has had consistent ambitions to win the presidency for 30 years, consistent ties to Russia for 30 years, and his most constant foreign policy stance is his deference, whether to the USSR or to independent Russia, for 30 years. I come back to how in God's name did other people see this? I did talk about this in 2016, and I either was mocked or I was threatened. And the combination of the two made me think that I was on the right track, looking back at all of these archival materials from the 80s and 90s. But it's interesting to me that people didn't spot it when, as you mentioned about your own book, a lot of it is lifted from these public domain resources, from all of the reporting that was done at that time. It was all out there. I'm a broken record on this. But if you have, more thoughts you want to share. If not, I would love to get your take on the Mueller report, because I thought the Mueller report was going to fill in those gaps on all those questions about this sort of long, decades back problem, and it really didn't.
No, right. No, to me, the most interesting part of the Mueller report was this one paragraph that drove me crazy, where you realize that there were supposed to be. Robert Mueller had a dual mandate, and part of it was criminal prosecution, but the other part was national security, counterintelligence. And he just has one paragraph saying that, he's giving all that information to the FBI. Well, what does that mean? What are they going to pursue it with William Barr as Attorney General? Is that going to move forward at all? And shouldn't that stuff be part of the public record? And most disturbingly, I saw Adam Schiff, head of the House Intelligence Committee, was tweeting the other day, whatever happened to that? Well,
you're Adam Schiff. You tell us.
Yes,
you have security clearance.
I want to know.
Yeah, that's disturbing to me. And another thing I've been wondering about with Mueller is, as Andrea mentioned, we all know his 2011 Iron Triangle speech. We know he was aware of the problem. We know he knew who Mogalevich was. He was head of the FBI from 2011 to 2013, when a lot of this money laundering and all this other criminal activity was going on right under his nose. Some of his indictments even are from that period, indictments of Manafort. Why didn't he do anything then?
Well, this is a big question. Again, I can only speculate, but I go back to the Whitey Bulger story, and if I'm not mistaken, Mueller was head of the FBI during Whitey Bulger as well. So that Mueller famously is an institutionalist. I've heard that word 1,000 times with regard to him, and he's incredibly loyal to his institution. which unfortunately I think these institutions are corrupt. And what do you do then? And I think we've seen it in his failure to really speak out. I mean, to me, he gave that very brief press conference, was it last week or whenever? But when he did so, I thought there were a couple of very, very false notes. And one was quite simply, he said he believed William Barr's statement had been made in good faith. And he doesn't believe that for a moment. He knows that's not the case, but he's being the good soldier going down with the ship, I think.
But the ship is sinking. His own former colleagues are being not just fired, but persecuted. There are talks of imprisoning them, executing them, people like Lacey Page, people like James Comey, Andrew McCabe. How can he, as an institutionalist, have such disregard for the people with whom he worked and who he should be protecting along with the American citizenry?
He's a few years older than me, but not that much. But he enlisted in Vietnam. That says about his allegiance to a lot about his allegiance to institutions. I mean, I think it was a crazy war, but he took part in it, and he's always done that kind of thing.
But at this point, when you have someone like Barr, just for example, misrepresenting his work so much, coming out with this little memo, even though Mueller apparently did provide him his own memo that was actually accurate about all the things in the report, comes out, says this. It takes Mueller a month to counter that. And meanwhile, the media narrative is building and people are saying that, Mueller found nothing, Trump is exonerated. That is a serious national security problem for Mueller to stay silent. Do you have any thoughts on why he's behaving this way? Some have thought he's threatened. Some have thought he maybe is corrupt. I don't really know myself, but
I have no evidence that he's corrupt. I see him as a good soldier, and I don't know more than that. I mean, he's got to be torn, I would think, but I don't know. I mean, he's played very much within those narrow rules. I mean, the other thing that I didn't really buy about his press conference is the way he referred to the famous OLC memo. As saying that it was a constitutional. Right. I don't think that's really the case.
No, not at all.
It's a very controversial memo among in the legal world, and they think it's policy is put out by one division, but it's questionable whether or not that should be the case.
Yeah, and several legal experts, including Preet Bharara, have said yes, the President of the United States can be indicted. Yes, our Constitution allows that. And we can't have our justice system held hostage by memos from the DOJ. They're just a few decades old compared to our U.S. Constitution. So I completely agree with you. That was some major gaslighting by Mueller, which I think, to Sarah's point, does raise suspicions about him. What game is he playing? Like how is he doing this to sleep better at night? Are we seeing a man justifying his actions to the world?
But let's go back to the Whitey Bulger and say, is that the same case with Felix Sater? Because if the FBI knew everything about Trump, he doesn't want that to come out. That would destroy the FBI.
That's what we've said on the show.
And that. This was the very first conversation I had when I started interviewing for the book. And I don't know if you know the lawyer, Frederick Oberlander. He has sued to try to unseal Felix Sater's agreement. And it has not been unsealed, to my knowledge, at least. But he was saying the single most important tool for the FBI is getting people to flip, getting them to turn informant or become a cooperator. And if they're to use that tool, they have to honor it every single time. They have to honor it even if Whitey Bulger is murdering his rivals. They have to honor it even if Felix Sater is laundering money with Donald Trump. And if that were to all come out and the FBI it could threaten the FBI's ability to use this incredibly important tool. I think anyone who's ever watched Law and Order or any one of 100 cop shows sees people turn state's evidence. If the FBI can't do that anymore, how can it prosecute organized crime? Just as a reporter doing this kind of reporting, you're interviewing people who are criminals or spies. They're both professional liars. Everyone lies. So what you have to do is then corroborate or refute what they say. And if Mueller throws that tool out of the window, if it's at risk, then maybe the whole FBI has been dealt a really, really almost mortal blow.
That's what I'm wondering, is what's the utility of the FBI in this environment? I mean, we know Trump and Barr and others are targeting it, but we also saw in the Mueller probe these kind of plea deals that went nowhere. Deals with Flynn, for example, or Gates, or the false deal with Manafort, where Manafort basically screwed Mueller over, which I saw coming, and I don't know how Mueller didn't. Like, what was the point of all of those little deals if there were so few indictments in the end, and if people didn't face any consequences?
I absolutely don't know, and I have to wonder how things are going to play out, because it feels like there's actually John McCain had a great line saying, "This centipede has many, many shoes to drop," and what's been enormously frustrating, I think, to all of us is if you follow this on a daily basis, there's a subpoena, they won't honor the subpoena, back and forth, but very few people are getting to the underlying crimes. What really happened? How did this happen? When did it start? I mean, that's what I try to do in House of Trump, and I realize that even that has barely scratched the surface.
Yeah, no, but it does, though. I mean, yours is, I think, the most thorough, of all the books on this topic in terms of Trump and its relationship to the Russian Mafia, which just seems like such a central thing. But when I watch these hearings, I mean, I hardly even hear that term. I don't hear the term mafia. I don't hear about Mogalevich. Like, it's these sort of renegade shows like me and Andrea doing this. When I talk about it on MSNBC, I get a lot of blowback. Like, has that been your experience, that people just don't want the story told?
There's a little of that, but there's also, it's complicated. They're Russian names. A lot of it has to do with familiarity. If you go back to 9/11, I mean, Osama bin Laden became a household name. But in general, a book with 50 Arab names, people say, and it's the same with Russian names. So you have to be committed to it. Also, I think Americans don't read. I mean, there's one reason I wish the Democrats would get their act together and have day after day of hearings, one after another. And it's the only way we can have a shared national narrative. And it happened with Watergate. And it's interesting, like, we know what Don McGahn would say because he says it in the Mueller report. But it has not penetrated the American psyche one iota, I think. And you have to have him on the stand, on camera, saying it, then everyone it'll be this dramatic moment. And I think there's a lot of that. And I mean, this is where Trump is a masterful showman and the Democrats are not.
Right. And I'm kind of wondering about that because we did see that kind of cohesive national narrative and that focus of attention on, for example, the Comey hearings, the Michael Cohen hearings, and then it stops. And then Pelosi's very adamantly against impeachment hearings, and just hearings in general have stopped for the most part. What's going on?
I have no idea, and I've tried to find out, and I've talked to people in various congressional committees, and the people who should know don't seem to know. And so I can't answer the question. It's driving me crazy. And, Felix Sater should be on. They don't need everything.
Well, he was scheduled and then they canceled it, right?
He was scheduled twice. He was supposed to be up there in March, and now we're in June.
What's really funny is all the Russiagate skeptics, they think that Trump's Russia ties basically began with the FBI launching Crossfire Hurricane in late July 2016. And they think this was all like a big Christopher Steele British FBI plot, like a coup against him because he was going to bash the institutions.
Right.
But your book is the anecdote to that, which shows the decades, several decades
right.
of
No,
Russiagate.
I started to read The Nation the other day, and I wanted to shoot myself because
was it a Stephen Cohen article?
Said, well, there's clearly no evidence. I see. Gosh, I guess I've wasted my time, and it's just very depressing. There is a disjunction where people don't realize the magnitude of what's happened, and I sometimes go back to Pearl Harbor, where we were attacked. The entire country knew it. We rose up and fought a war. But today there are no bombs or bullets or boots on the ground, so no one can see anything. It looks nice outside, and isn't everything lovely and wonderful? But in Pearl Harbor, the Japanese didn't come close to taking over the White House. The Russians did that without firing a shot. And that's why I like your title, Gaslight nation. I mean, it's like, no, everything seems fine. It's just, let's go about, everything's just hunky-dory. But he is a Russian asset. There's a Russian asset in the White House. And for John Brennan or Clapper to say things like that, they're not loose-lipped guys, you know. They are they're not wild lefties or anything saying this kind of stuff. And that means it's a very, very serious threat to national security.
We want to thank you so much for moving in with us and getting your own bunk bed here at Gaslit Nation. And
thank you for having me.
Our discussion continues, and you can get access to that by signing up on our Patreon at the Truth Teller level or higher. Gaslit Nation is produced by Sarah Kenzier and Andrea Chalupa. If you like what we do, leave us a review on iTunes. It helps us reach more listeners. And check out our Patreon. It keeps us going.
Our editors are Carlin Daigle and Nicholas Torres. This episode was edited by Nicholas Torres.
Original music in Gaslit Nation was produced by David Whitehead, Martin Vissenberg, Nick Farr, Damien Arriaga, and Carlin Daigle.
Our logo design was donated to us by Hamish Smith of the New York-based firm Order. Thank you so much, Hamish.
Gaslit Nation would like to thank our supporters at the producer level on Patreon: Solomon Hikes, Alan Liu, David Porter, Joel Newman, Paige Harrington, Adam Levine, Alexandria Lane Detweiler, Glenda de Guzman, Henri Duchamp, Jared Lombardo, Jody DeWitt, John Ripley, Kate Cotton, Kelly Ranson, Kevin M. Garnett, Lorraine W. Todd, Tanya Chalupa, Terry Brady, Zachary Lemon, Ann Marshall, Michael Bayland, Brian Tahudin, Carolyn Friend, Catherine Anderson Carina, Kathy Kavanaugh, Diana Gallagher, D.L. Singfield, Doug Friedenberg, Eric Kaplan, Irina Guardia, Ethan Mann, George Hughes, Gordon Shumway, Gustav Halsby, James Tolley, Jason Rita, Jennifer Slavic, Jans Alstrup Rasmussen, John Dambro, John Keene, Kinshira Nakagawa, Kevin Christie, Kim Mellon, Christy Vital, Larry Colwell, Lawrence Graham, Luke Stranad, Margaret Moe, Matt Perez, Matthew Copeland, Maureen Murphy, Michelle Dash, Mike Tripico, Nicole Spear, Rhonda White, Rich Craw, Sonia Bogdanovic, Ted Gary Mitchell, Thomas Burns, Victoria Olson, Zap Rousdower, and Hollis Ramsey. Thank you all for your support. We could not make this show without you. To deal with these abnormal times that we find ourselves in, we here at Gaslight Nation take a strong stance of saying no to savior syndrome. The only thing that's going to get us out of this is self-reliance and holding our leaders accountable. And the only power we have left that we can rely on is grassroots power. To illustrate our point, here's Share, providing a useful metaphor for these times. Rely on no one but your own hard work and dedication. That's the only way out of this. Awaken your inner Share.
You said a man is not a necessity, a man is a luxury.
Like dessert. Yeah. A man is absolutely not a necessity.
Did you mean that to sound mean and bitter?
Oh, not at all. I adore dessert. I love men. I think men are the coolest. But you don't really need them to live. My mom said to me, you know, sweetheart, one day you should settle down and marry a rich man. And I said, Mom, I am a rich man.
Welcome to the Gaslit Nation Action Guide, available on our website, gaslitnationpod.com. Democracy is a lifestyle. Trump is a symptom of the corruption, institutional failure, and indifference that we can no longer tolerate.
Okay, so number one, get a guide. Stride Toward Freedom, the Montgomery Story by Martin Luther King Jr. is an essential guide to self-management, managing others, and building teams. This inspirational case study of resistance, written by a young MLK after successfully leading the Montgomery bus boycott, shows how smart organization took on the authoritarianism of the Jim Crow South. Never forget that MLK was considered a radical in his day, even though there's nothing radical about demanding human rights and dignity. Today, the same remains true. It's not radical or socialist to demand that corporations stop polluting for profits and to call for an end to tax breaks, like for sending jobs overseas, that worsen the income inequality crisis. To help communicate these urgent issues, another essential guide is the all-new Don't Think of an Elephant, Know Your Values, and Frame the Debate by George Lakoff.
Number 2 of the Gaslit Nation Action Guide, focus on state races. States decide key quality of life issues, and local candidates help drive votes up ballot for federal races. Every District and Future Now are 2 excellent groups working to build a progressive infrastructure and turn states blue from the bottom up. Get involved by donating what you can, or join or start your own group with their help in your state. We provide on our Action Guide interviews with every district and Future Now. For more background.
Number 3, join. Grassroots power is one of the strongest forms of power we have left in America, especially with Mitch McConnell and Trump packing the courts. Don't succumb to savior syndrome by expecting Alexandria Ocasio-Cortez or whomever else you admire to do all the work. Representatives are human and need our help. Fulfill the far-right's worst nightmare by creating generations of AOCs by helping build a more progressive union. Join a local group from any of these great national organizations for important action alerts like demonstrations or getting out the vote. Indivisible, Swing Left, Sister District, Move On, Flippable.
Number 4, fight global warming. Sunrise Movement is a grassroots organization demanding a Green New Deal. There are a lot of other groups working to adopt urgently needed green initiatives. C40 Cities connects cities around the world committed to taking climate action. 350.org helps activists rise to the challenge of the climate crisis. And there are more trusted organizations that need our support, linked to on our Action Guide.
Number 5, unionize. In the age of Trump, there should be no more fear of starting or joining a union. Just tell your boss that you saw how unions protected workers during the universally unpopular Trump shutdown. Fight for 15 and its local variants are working to ensure a fair wage and strengthen unions in the service sector. Don't know how to get started? Read Organizing to Win, New Research on Union Strategies, and No Shortcuts, Organizing for Power in the New Gilded Age, both of which are linked to on the Gaslit Nation website.
Number 6, run for something. There are a lot of great groups out there that demystify the process of becoming a candidate and running a campaign. Run for Something is one of our favorites. There's even a book to help you get started. Run for Something, a real talk guide to fixing the system yourself by Amanda Littman. If you believe in facts and science and are a compassionate human being, you need to run for something and recruit others to as well. Even if it's a long shot, you can still create urgent conversations and treat your campaign like a platform for discussions you care about, helping bring together like-minded people to work for change even long past the election. Just look at what a refreshing discovery long-shot Mayor Pete has been and all the great work Andrew Gillum continues to do to register 1 million voters in Florida.
Number 7, protect the vote. Every District Action Fund just launched a, quote, report card identifying states with enough progressive support and local governments to push through important voting reforms like automatic registration and the abolishment of racist voter ID laws. Is your state on the list? You can click a link and find out. If so, every District Action Fund empowers you to help your state reach the gold standard of voting. Concerned about vote hacking and Ivanka Trump branded voting machines? Yes, that is a thing. Secure Our Vote provides background information and other resources to take action. Other groups to check out are Spread the Vote, Let America Vote, and Project ID, which help people get the information they need to register, vote, and get an ID. And again, these are linked to on our site.
Number 8. Launch ballot initiatives and laws. Why not launch a ballot initiative? Kate Fahey turned her Facebook post into the movement Voters Not Politicians to end gerrymandering in Michigan. It passed overwhelmingly. We have a link on our Action Guide for you to read more of her story. Or you could build a grassroots coalition to get a law passed in your state. In our episode, How to Pass a Law, I interview my mother about how she, while pregnant with me and a young mother already, without any political experience, mobilized a grassroots army to pass the child car seat law in California. Yes, it can be done.
Number 9, end terrorism in America. Moms Demand works to elect candidates and lobby for sensible legislation to stop the gun violence epidemic driven by the blood money gun lobby, the NRA. Southern Poverty Law Center exposes white supremacy, a leading terrorist movement in America. To help immigrant communities deliberately terrorized by Trump's cruel border policies, we have a list linked here of groups that you can support.
Number 10, make art. To say that art cannot make a difference stems from a tone-deaf attitude of privilege. Ukraine's Euromaidan revolution of 2013 and 2014 relied on art and artists of all kinds to sustain protesters living in Arctic cold temperatures and under the threat of government-sanctioned violence. North Korean dissident Yeonmi Park said that Orwell's Animal Farm helped her heal after escaping the cult-like dictatorship. And in our episode, The Blue Wave Continues, Kansas Rising, we share Davis Hammett's account of how painting a rainbow house created a ripple effect in Kansas, leading to major electoral victories. We need the artists and storytellers of all kinds more than ever.
So this is not a comprehensive list of suggestions on how you can create a more progressive America and stop entrenched corruption. There are many paths you can take, and we encourage you to think for yourself and to work together. There is no one solution. Whether you're in a blue state or a red state, these ideas apply to you. Do not take any of the freedoms you have left for granted. Never underestimate the power of hard work. Additionally, we have a reading list linked to from there because it's essential to read widely to understand how we got here and the best ways to navigate the challenges of the 21st century. So again, all of this is available on our site, gaslitnationpod.com.